Hey there, welcome back to Branded. I'm your host, Sarah, and today is all about an honest account of decisions that I made that I would do differently now. Specific ones with real numbers and a real cost, because I think there's something genuinely useful in hearing someone say the specific thing that they got wrong rather than the polished version of it. So that's what this episode is all about. Three decisions, what happened, what it actually cost, and what I know now that I didn't know then. So, decision one, I stayed fragmented for way too long. What do I mean by this? So, for a year or more, I was paying somewhere between $100 to $300 a month on tools that each did one thing. I had an email platform, a separate CRM, something for scheduling, booking calls, something for opt-in forms, something else for automations. So each one of these platforms, they technically worked, and none of them talked to each other in a way that actually made my business feel like a coherent system rather than a collection of individual parts being held together by me. And I knew what the solution was to move everything into an all-in-one platform, stop paying for five or more tools that do only one job. But building something that actually runs together instead of alongside each other takes time. And at first I didn't do it. Like I said, for a year or more, I kept my business so fragmented across all of these platforms. And my reason for procrastinating, when I'm actually honest about it, were all the reasons that you probably give yourself. Oh, if I migrate my business, it feels really overwhelming. So I'll just move it on to next month. I didn't know what I was actually spending on all of these platforms until I finally sat down and added it all up. And quite honestly, I felt a little sick about it. And if I'm being completely honest, I was also really attached to these tools that I already knew how to use, even when they weren't the best solution and they didn't even work together. So instead, I kept adding new tools to solve other problems that the existing tools were creating, which is as ridiculous as it sounds, right? It's this vicious loop of like, well, this tool doesn't do this thing, so let me purchase this tool. So now this tool can talk to this tool. And now you have three things working. It's such a mess. It's such a mess. I spent real money on these things for a year or more. But the cost that I actually think about more is the operational weight of it, because every time I needed something to connect to something else, I was the one who had to do it. Every time a new client came in, I was manually running through which platform did what and in what order and whether everything had been set up correctly. I was a fundamental layer for a business that could have easily had one built in. And I stayed there longer than I should have because the migration into an all-in-one platform felt like more work than just living in this fragmented reality, which is the kind of logic that makes complete sense in the moment and absolutely no sense when you look back at it. So, what I know now, the cost of migration is a one-time investment. The cost of staying fragmented across all of these different platforms is ongoing every month in the money you're spending and in the mental overhead that you're spending. And that mental overhead, that like capacity that you're giving to it is actually more expensive than the money. The second decision, I was launching before everything was ready. So I want to be a little more specific about this because I think the general version of it, I launched too early. That's something a lot of founders say without really naming the issue that was really costing them. Here's what wasn't ready when I launched: the onboarding, the sales page, the automations, and honestly, the offer itself. I simply launched and figured it out. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with that. But it comes a time where that sort of figuring it out will come back around and force you to face it and clean it up and do something about it. And the reason I was doing this was simple and maybe a little uncomfortable to say directly, but I felt pressured to generate revenue, not necessarily external pressure. It was much more of an internal game. It's the kind that comes from watching the business and thinking that it needs to produce something new. So I launched and I launched and I launched into something that wasn't built to hold the clients that I was bringing in. What it actually cost me across these launches was more than I want to admit. I manually onboarded every single client, not because I wanted to, but because there was no automated onboarding to do it for me. Every purchase meant I had to notice that it happened, send the right things to this person, set up the right access, and follow up to make sure everything landed for every single person. So I would spend my launch week fixing things instead of selling. The page wasn't finished, so I'm editing it while also promoting it. The automations weren't set up, so I'm doing that manually when it should be happening automatically. Basically, I'm building the plane while flying it and also trying to convince people to buy the ticket. Clients had a rocky start, right? It wasn't terrible and maybe wasn't even super noticeable to them, but it's not the experience that I wanted them to have. And that rocky start, it affected the relationship in ways that didn't fully resolve after everything was smoothed out because first impressions are hard to overwrite. I burned out shortly after from all that operational weight of delivering something that was being built as it was being delivered. And perhaps the most honest fact that I can give you right now is the revenue came in, but the cost of delivering it really didn't outweigh. And I spent so much time compensating for what wasn't built. So here's what I know now about this. Revenue that comes at the cost of your capacity, your client relationships, and your confidence in the offer that you're selling isn't the win it looks like when you're looking at like a revenue report. The pressure I felt to launch was real, but launching into something that isn't ready didn't solve that pressure. It just moved it into a different, more expensive form. So if I were doing it again, I would have built the onboarding first. Not a perfect version, but a working version, one that could handle a client coming in at 2 in the morning without me having to be awake to make sure it all happened correctly. That's the minimum. And I skipped it because I was in a hurry. Decision three, saying yes to clients when I already know they may not be a good fit. This one's the hardest to talk about because it involves other people. It's not just me. So I'll keep specifics vague while being honest. So this is how it usually happened for me. I'd be on a call with someone who wanted to work with me, and somewhere in the middle of that call, I would get this feeling really quietly, the kind that you can really easily talk yourself out of if you want to. And I did want to because I was launching my business and trying to get clients and really trying to figure out what it is I was the best at. So I took the client. I convinced myself during the call that it would just all work out, that the things that felt slightly off would be manageable, that whatever work that I do would bridge that gap that I was sensing, that the feeling was just me being nervous, right? Me being a new business owner, or maybe I'm overthinking it. But here's the real reason I said yes. I didn't have clear enough criteria for who I worked best with. I hadn't really done the work of defining specifically what kind of client brings out my best work, versus the kind that cost more than the return. And without that clarity, I was making the decision based on the revenue and the benefit of the doubt rather than the real data in front of me. So it's not that this client was a bad person, right? The work wasn't a disaster. It got done, but it was hard in a way that I kept trying to compensate for. And the compensation cost me things that I simply couldn't get back, like the energy that didn't come back for weeks because I felt like I had just been like sucked dry of all of this good energy that I had. Not really burned out, but more like this flatness that sort of sat underneath everything else I was trying to do because I was trying so hard to make this one client fit. A period of like genuinely questioning whether my offer was as good as I thought it was. Because when a client relationship is hard, it's really easy to attribute that difficulty to the offer rather than whether they're a good fit. And I was doing that. I spent real time second guessing work that was actually good because I was inside of a client relationship that wasn't a good fit. And it changed how I showed up in my business for longer than I wanted it to. Not necessarily visibly to other clients, but in how present I felt, in how much of my creative capacity was available, in how much of me was in it versus just managing it. And what I know now, a clearly defined client profile is not a marketing exercise. It's almost a sense of protection. It's what you come back to when you're on a call and you have the feeling and you want to talk yourself out of it. If she's a good fit, she fits. If she doesn't, you have something specific to point to rather than just, oh, I have this feeling. The revenue from a wrong fit client is not just free and clear revenue, it comes with additional interest, I guess you could say. And that interest gets paid in your energy, your presence, your confidence. It gets paid in ways that show up across the whole business, not just in that one client relationship. So these three decisions, they have something in common. And I didn't plan this when I started writing this episode, but I see it now where in every case, I made the decision that felt like the easier path in that moment. Stay with the tools I know, launch now instead of waiting until it's ready. Say yes instead of having the harder conversation. And in every case, the easier path was actually more expensive than the harder one would have been. Not immediately, but over time, and usually in ways that were hard to trace back to the original decision. The harder path in every case would have been do the migration now, build the onboarding before you launch, get clear on who you work best with before you get on the call. None of these things are complicated, but they all require a kind of honesty in the moment that's harder than the alternative. An honesty that says, this isn't ready yet, and I'm going to wait, even though waiting feels like losing. What I've come to understand is that the decisions that feel like losing in the short term are very often the ones that actually protect you in the long term. Not always, but enough that I've stopped trusting the feeling of momentum as a reason to skip doing the hard stuff. And the reason I'm telling you this, I'm not sharing this to like be relatable or vulnerable. I'm sharing this because I think these kinds of mistakes are more useful than giving you like a general lesson about it. So, a general lesson would be something like don't launch before you're ready. But specifically, I had every single piece of the infrastructure missing and I launched anyways because I felt pressure to generate revenue, and it cost me more than the revenue was worth. So maybe you only want to work with clients who are a good fit, right? Yeah, we know that. But specifically, I didn't have written criteria. I had a feeling on a call. I talked myself out of that feeling and I paid for that conversation in energy and presence and confidence for weeks afterwards. The specific kind of version mistake that I'm talking to you about is what you can actually do something with because it's close enough to your own experience that you can map it onto a decision you're facing right now, probably, and ask yourself honestly, is this the easier path that's actually going to cost me more? And if yes, you already know what to do. The harder path will get you there. Share this with a founder who has a decision in front of her right now that she's been talking herself into, right? Maybe this will help her see it differently. Please rate and review. I'd love to hear your comments, and I'll see you next week for a brand new episode.